The first thing I noticed was the sound, the hollow clang of steel on steel echoing across the valley at 7:12 a.m., sharp enough to cut through the morning fog like a warning shot without a gun. I was halfway across my own bridge, coffee still warm in my hand, when the red and white barrier dropped in front of my truck like it had been waiting for me specifically. The smell of fresh paint hit next, cheap, chemical, rushed, mixing with the damp scent of river water 50 feet below. That's when I saw her. Victoria Hale. White Lexus parked sideways at the far end, heels clicking against the concrete deck like she owned every inch of it. Clipboard in hand. Sunglasses too big for her face. Smile too small to be real. "This is now a controlled access point," she said, voice smooth, rehearsed, like she'd practiced it in a mirror. Behind her, two men in matching polo shirts stood next to a temporary booth they'd bolted right into my guardrail overnight. A printed sign flapped in the breeze. Willow Ridge Community Bridge, authorized entry only. I just sat there for a second, engine idling, watching the morning sun catch the steel cables my grandfather helped tension back in 1972. Every bolt, every weld, every inch of that 180-foot span was something I grew up around. Learned on, bled on. This wasn't just a bridge. It was the only way in and out of 47 acres of land my family had held for 3 generations. And now there was a plastic barrier and a woman with a clipboard telling me I needed permission to cross it. "You'll need a resident pass," she continued, tapping her pen against the board like she was checking off groceries. HOA voted last night. Community Safety Initiative. Community. That word hung in the air like it belonged to someone else. I looked past her, down the road that led to my house, the same gravel path that crunched under my boots since I was 10 years old. The same path my dad drove down in his old F-150, windows down, country radio humming through the summer heat. Now there was a guard station at the mouth of it. Temporary fencing. Fresh stakes hammered into soil that had never belonged to anyone but us. I stepped out of the truck. The metal deck felt cool under my boots, but the air, something about it felt tight, like pressure building before a storm. "You're blocking a private structure," I said, keeping my voice level. Years of engineering meetings taught me one thing. Never raise your voice when the facts can do it for you. Victoria tilted her head, smile tightening just enough to show the edge underneath. "It's not private anymore, Mr. Caldwell. Not the way the board sees it." That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't confusion. This was a takeover. Clean. Fast. Papered over with just enough authority to make it look legitimate. The kind of move that only works if the person on the other side doesn't know exactly what they own. I glanced down at the base of the barrier, where they'd drilled straight into the expansion joint without so much as a permit marking. Sloppy. Rushed. Illegal. My fingers tightened around the coffee cup until the lid creaked. She thought this was her bridge now. Thought a vote in a clubhouse and a printed sign could rewrite 50 years of ownership. I almost laughed. Almost. Because what she didn't know, what none of them knew standing there behind that plastic gate, was that this bridge wasn't just mine. I didn't just own the structure. I owned the land on both sides of it. And that changed everything. I grew up hearing that bridge before I ever understood what it meant. The low hum of tires rolling across steel, the faint vibration that traveled through the ground and into the porch floorboards like a heartbeat you could feel in your bones if you stood still long enough. And my grandfather used to say that if you listened close enough you could tell who was coming home just by the rhythm of the sound, slow and steady for him, a little faster for my dad, and reckless when I first got my license at 16 and thought horsepower meant something more than responsibility. And that bridge saw all of it, every season, every storm, every late-night return when the headlights cut through the trees and the river below reflected just enough light to remind you how high up you really were. 180 feet of reinforced concrete and steel spanning a narrow canyon that most developers had written off as unusable back in the 70s. But my grandfather did not see obstacles the way other men did. He saw leverage, he saw access, he saw a way to connect land that nobody else could reach. And he spent 2 years of his life building that structure with a crew of 5 men, hauling materials down dirt paths that barely qualified as roads, measuring everything twice and pouring every footing like it was going to carry the weight of the world, because to him it did. It carried our future. 47 acres of rolling Texas hillside that sat isolated until that bridge made it reachable. And I learned engineering the same way most kids learn baseball, standing next to him with a tape measure in my hand, smelling diesel and wet concrete, listening to him explain load distribution like it was a story instead of a formula, telling me that if you control access, you control everything: land, water, movement, even people. And I did not fully understand that lesson until years later when I went to college, got my degree in civil engineering, and started designing infrastructure for cities that paid millions of dollars for what my grandfather had built with stubbornness and a pickup truck. But no matter how far I went or how many projects I touched, that bridge was always the one thing that mattered. Because it was not just structure, it was proof. Proof that ownership is not just a piece of paper. It is something you build, something you maintain, something you defend even when nobody else sees its value. And when my grandfather passed, he left everything to my father. And when my father passed 5 years later, it came to me: every acre, every fence line, every survey marker, and most importantly, every legal description tied to that bridge. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of documents thick enough to stop a door, the smell of old paper and ink filling the room, while the lawyer walked me through each parcel, each boundary, each clause written decades before I was born. And there was one line he paused on, just one, buried in a description that most people would have skimmed right past, stating clearly that the bridge and both connecting land parcels remained under a single ownership with no transferable easement beyond temporary agricultural access. And I remember asking him what that meant in plain English, and he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said it means nobody gets to control that bridge unless they own what is on both sides of it. And at the time it felt like a technical detail, just another piece of legal language to file away and forget, because nobody had ever tried to take it. Nobody had ever questioned it. Until Victoria Hale showed up 2 years ago with her development plans and her neighborhood meetings and her promises about property values and community growth, and I watched from a distance as Willow Ridge went from a quiet stretch of land to a grid of identical houses with manicured lawns and rules about everything from mailbox colors to grass height. And I stayed out of it because my land was not part of their association, my road was not their road, and my bridge was not their concern, or at least that is what I thought. Standing there now with the morning sun rising behind her, and that barrier cutting across steel that had been in my family longer than she had probably lived in the state, I could feel that old lesson coming back in a way that was no longer theoretical, because this was not just about a structure anymore. This was about control, and she had just made the mistake of trying to take it from someone who understood exactly how it worked. Victoria Hale did not arrive all at once like a storm. She moved in like a slow pressure change that most people did not notice until it was already too late. And the first time I saw her, she was standing at the edge of a freshly cleared lot about half a mile from my property line, hills planted in red Texas dirt that still smelled like uprooted cedar and wet clay, talking to a group of contractors with that same measured tone she used on the bridge, calm, confident, like she had already decided how everything was going to end before anyone else realized there was even a decision to be made. And over the next 6 months her presence spread across Willow Ridge the way new asphalt spreads across an old road, covering everything in something smooth, uniform, controlled, replacing uneven ground with straight lines and written rules. And people liked that at first. They liked the order, the predictability, the promise that property values would go up and problems would go away, because that is what she sold them. Not just houses, but a version of stability that came with bylaws and signatures and a board that met every second Thursday at 7 p.m. sharp. And by the time the first set of mailboxes went in and the identical streetlights started humming at dusk, Victoria was no longer just a resident. She was the president, unopposed. Because nobody else wanted the job of enforcing rules on their neighbors. But she did. She leaned into it the same way some people lean into authority when they realize it fits them a little too well. And I watched from my side of the bridge as her influence turned into enforcement. Small things at first. Citations for trash cans left out too long. Warnings about fence heights. Reminders about approved paint colors. All wrapped in language that sounded reasonable until you looked at the pattern. Until you saw how every decision pointed in the same direction. More control. More reach. More ground claimed without ever saying the word ownership out loud. And then came the meetings about access, about traffic flow, about safety concerns tied to the only route in and out of the valley, my bridge, And I remember the first flyer that showed up in my mailbox, even though I was not part of their association, printed on thick paper with a bold header that read Community Infrastructure Improvement Discussion, and underneath it a map that had been redrawn just enough to make my bridge look like a shared asset instead of a private one. Lines extended, boundaries softened, language adjusted to suggest what they wanted people to believe rather than what was actually written in the deed. And I almost ignored it, almost tossed it on the counter, and went back to work because I had projects in Austin that paid real money and real deadlines. But something about the way that map was drawn stuck with me. The way the access road was labeled as a connector instead of a private route. The way the bridge was shaded the same color as their internal streets. And when I drove past one of their meetings a week later, I saw her through the glass windows of the clubhouse, standing at the front of the room with a laser pointer in her hand, walking a group of homeowners through a plan that made it sound like the bridge had always been part of their system, like it was just waiting to be formalized. And people nodded because it made sense on paper, because they trusted the person holding the pointer, because nobody in that room had ever read the documents I had sitting in my kitchen drawer. And that was her real advantage, not the position, not the connections, but the assumption that nobody would check her, that nobody would go back far enough to see where the lines were actually drawn. And when she finally drove up to my side of the bridge for the first time, white Lexus rolling slow over steel that did not belong to her, window lowering just enough for her voice to carry, she did not introduce herself like a neighbor. She introduced herself like a representative, like someone speaking on behalf of something larger than both of us, explaining how the community was growing, how access needed to be standardized, how cooperation would benefit everyone involved. And I remember the way her smile held steady even when I told her no, even when I made it clear that my land was not part of her association and never would be, because she did not react the way most people do when they hear no. She did not argue. She did not push. She just nodded once, slow, deliberate, like she had already accounted for that answer in whatever plan she was building. And as she drove away that day, tires humming across the span my grandfather built, I had the distinct feeling that the conversation was not over, that it had not even really started yet. And standing there now with her barrier locked into place, and her people treating my bridge like a checkpoint, I could finally see the full shape of what she had been building all along, not just a neighborhood, but a system designed to absorb anything connected to it. And she had just reached the part of that system where my bridge sat, assuming it would fold into her control the same way everything else had. The first truck that was not mine got stopped at 7:26 a.m., a delivery driver in a faded blue pickup rolling up slow, window down, radio low, expecting the same easy crossing everyone had used for decades. And I watched from 10 yards back as he hit the brakes when that plastic arm blocked his path. Confusion turning into irritation in the span of a few seconds, the engine idling louder than it should have in the quiet morning air, while one of Victoria's men stepped forward with a clipboard like he was checking in guests at a hotel instead of blocking access to a piece of private infrastructure. And the driver leaned out the window, asking something I could not hear over the hum of the river below, but I could read the expression on his face when he was told he needed authorization, the kind of disbelief that comes from being told a rule that has never existed before suddenly applies to you. And behind him another vehicle pulled up, then another, a slow line forming on steel that had never been anything but open. And that was the moment it stopped being theoretical, stopped being about paperwork and meetings and maps drawn in a clubhouse, because now there were real people being turned around on something that had always worked, always flowed, always connected. And Victoria stood off to the side watching it like it was proof of concept, arms folded, posture relaxed, like this was exactly how she had imagined it would look, controlled, orderly, hers. And I could feel the shift in the air, the way tension settles into a place when something changes that is not supposed to change. The sound of engines idling longer than usual, the faint smell of exhaust, mixing with the morning dew, and I stepped forward, boots hitting the deck with that solid, familiar echo that used to mean home and now sounded more like a warning. And the man with the clipboard looked at me like I was just another driver in line, another person to process, until I told him to lift the barrier. And he hesitated, just for a second, long enough to glance back at Victoria. And that told me everything I needed to know about how this was set up, not random, not temporary, but directed, controlled from a single point. And she gave the smallest shake of her head. almost polite, almost subtle, and the barrier stayed down, and the driver in front of me sighed, put his truck in reverse, and started backing up carefully, tires squeaking, against concrete that had never been used for that purpose, turning around in a space not designed for it. Because the only thing worse than being stopped is realizing you have nowhere to go forward. And I watched him leave, then the next car, then the next, a quiet retreat happening one vehicle at a time, while the sign flapped above them like it had always been there, like this was normal, like this was allowed. And that was when I realized how fast control can take hold when it is presented. With enough confidence, because nobody argued, nobody pushed, they just adjusted, rerouted, accepted it as another inconvenience in a world full of them. And that is how systems like this survive, not through force, but through assumption, through the idea that if something looks official enough, it must be legitimate, and I could see it working in real time. The way Victoria's version of reality was starting to overwrite the one that had existed here for 50 years, and she turned toward me. Then, sunglasses catching the light, that same measured smile in place like she was about to explain something simple to someone who just had not caught up yet. And she stepped closer, heels clicking against the deck in steady rhythm, stopping just short of the barrier, just short of where my side of the bridge began, and she said this is temporary until we finalize the access agreement. Like it was already in motion, like my consent was just a formality waiting to be signed, and I looked past her again, down the road that led to my house. Quiet now in a way it had never been. No tire noise, no movement. Just stillness where there should have been flow, and something in me settled. Not anger, not panic, but clarity. Because this was no longer about what she thought the bridge was. It was about what I knew it was. And more importantly, what she had just done by putting that barrier in place without understanding the one thing that actually mattered. Because the moment she decided to control access to that span, she stepped into a legal space she did not even know existed. And I could feel that realization forming like a blueprint in my head. Every line connecting, every mistake she made becoming a point I could use. And as I set my coffee down on the hood of my truck and looked back at that barrier locked into my structure, I understood something my grandfather had tried to teach me years ago in a way that finally made complete sense. You do not fight for control by pushing harder. You win it by knowing exactly where the other person is standing when they think they are in charge, and she was standing right in the middle of it. I tried the simple route first because that is what you are supposed to do. You document, you communicate, you give the other side a chance to correct themselves before things escalate into something bigger, and by 9:15 a.m. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a stack of documents spread out in front of me, the same ones I had reviewed years ago when everything transferred into my name, pages worn at the edges, legal descriptions written in language that does not leave room for interpretation if you actually take the time to read it. And I called the number listed on the HOA letterhead that had magically appeared on my mailbox overnight, the one with their logo stamped in bold blue ink like they were some kind of official authority beyond a neighborhood committee. And after 2 rings, a receptionist answered with a voice that sounded like she had already been coached on how to handle calls like mine. Calm, polite, just distant enough to keep everything procedural. And I explained the situation clearly. No emotion, no accusations, just facts. That the structure they had placed a barrier on was privately owned. That there was no legal basis for restricting access. That whatever vote they had taken did not apply to property outside their association. And she listened. Or at least she made the right sounds at the right moments. And then she transferred me to Victoria without hesitation, like this had been expected, like my call was just another step in a process she had already mapped out. And when Victoria picked up, her voice carried that same steady confidence it had on the bridge, like she was not responding to a problem, but managing a situation. And she thanked me for reaching out as if I was cooperating instead of challenging her. And she explained again that the community had voted to regulate access for safety reasons, that increased traffic required oversight, that temporary measures were necessary while they formalized agreements. And I let her finish because sometimes the most important part of a conversation is not what you say, but what you let the other person commit to on record. And when she paused, I asked her one question, simple, direct. Where exactly in the recorded deed or county filings does your association have the authority to control that structure? And there was a silence then, not long, just enough to register, and she shifted slightly, not in tone but in wording. moving away from specifics into broader language about community benefit and shared access. And that was the answer, or rather the lack of one. And I told her I would be sending formal notice to remove the obstruction immediately, that any continued restriction of access would be documented as interference with private property. And she responded with a phrase that sounded rehearsed. "We will have our legal team review your concerns." Like that alone settled something. Like delay was a strategy instead of a risk, and we ended the call there. Professional, controlled, nothing raised, nothing resolved, and I printed the notice, signed it, and drove it down to the HOA office, a small building off their main entrance that smelled faintly of air freshener and new carpet, where the receptionist accepted it with a tight smile and placed it neatly on a stack of similar papers that made me wonder how many other people had tried the same approach before me. And by the time I got back to the bridge just after noon, the barrier was still there, the same sign still flapping, the same two men still checking imaginary credentials like they were part of a system that actually existed, and something about that told me more than anything Victoria had said on the phone. Because if this had been a misunderstanding, it would have been corrected. If this had been a mistake, it would have been fixed. But it was neither. It was deliberate, calculated, and more importantly, it was backed by the assumption that I would follow the expected path, file paperwork, wait for responses, operate within a timeline that benefited her position while she continued to control access in the meantime, and standing there watching another car turn around because someone with a clipboard said they had to. I felt that shift again, the one where this stopped being a conversation and became something else entirely, because I had just done everything the right way, and it changed nothing. And that is when you realize you are not dealing with a misunderstanding. You are dealing with a strategy, and strategies do not respond to requests. They respond to pressure. And I could see it clearly now. The way she expected this to play out, slow, controlled, predictable. But what she did not account for was the fact that I was not just someone with paperwork. I was someone who understood exactly how systems like hers worked, and more importantly, exactly where they broke. And as I looked at that barrier locked into my bridge, still sitting there like it belonged, I understood something with absolute certainty. This was not going to be solved by asking her to move it, because she had already decided not to. By 2:40 p.m. the heat had settled into the metal like a slow burn, the kind that makes the air shimmer just above the surface, and I was back at my kitchen table again. But this time I was not looking for confirmation. I was looking for leverage, and that meant going deeper than the surface-level documents I had already pulled. Because if Victoria was confident enough to install a barrier on private infrastructure, she was either reckless or she believed she had something backing her up, and I needed to know which one it was. So I opened the old survey records first, the original plats drawn in precise black ink on paper that had aged into a soft yellow, lines straight, measurements exact, every boundary locked into coordinates that did not care about HOA meetings or neighborhood votes. And I traced the access road with my finger, followed it all the way to the bridge, then across to the opposite ridge. And there it was again, the same detail the lawyer had pointed out years ago, but that I had never truly needed until now. Both sides of that bridge tied to the same parcel ownership. No subdivision, no split, no shared easement beyond a temporary agricultural clause that had expired decades ago when the land stopped being leased for cattle movement. And that was the first crack in her system, because without an active easement there was no legal pathway for her association to claim control, not even partial. And I leaned back in my chair, the faint smell of dust and paper filling the room, letting that settle for a second before moving on, because ownership was one thing, but enforcement was another. And if she had managed to get local compliance on her side, there had to be something filed somewhere, some permit, some notice, some paperwork that gave her just enough cover to act like she belonged there. So I logged into the county records database and started searching by address, by parcel number, by anything tied to Willow Ridge. And what I found was not what I expected, because there was nothing, no permit filed for barrier installation, no traffic control application, no temporary access regulation request, nothing that would justify placing a physical obstruction on a structure that carried daily vehicle flow. And that absence was louder than any document could have been, because it meant she had skipped the one step that actually mattered, the one that would have forced her to put her claim in writing under review. And that told me everything about how she was operating, fast, visible, confident enough that nobody would challenge it before it became normalized. And I could feel the pieces starting to connect now. The way her entire strategy depended on momentum, on people accepting the new reality before they had time to question it. And I stood up, walked over to the window, and looked out toward the ridge where the bridge cut across the valley, invisible from here, but always present in my mind like a fixed point on a map. And that was when the second realization hit. The one that shifted this from a defensive position into something else entirely. Because if she had no permit, no easement, and no ownership claim, then every single action she had taken on that structure was not just questionable. It was unauthorized use of private infrastructure, and more importantly, interference with controlled access that was legally defined by the land on both ends. And that phrase stuck with me for a second, controlled access, because that was exactly what she had tried to create, just without the authority to do it. And I walked back to the table, pulled out one more document, one I had not looked at in years, the original engineering filing tied to the bridge itself, the one that referenced load limits, maintenance obligations, and operational control. And there it was in plain language. The structure was registered under private maintenance jurisdiction with access governed by the owner of the connecting parcels, not by any external entity, not by any adjacent development, but by the person who held both sides of the crossing. And I felt a slow smile form, not out of satisfaction but out of clarity, because now, I was not guessing anymore. I was not reacting. I was looking at a system that had a very specific weakness, and she had built her entire move right on top of it. And the more I thought about it, the more obvious it became. She had assumed control without understanding what controlled it. And that kind of mistake does not just create a problem. It creates an opening. And as I gathered the documents into a single stack, the paper edges aligning clean under my hand, I understood exactly where to apply pressure, not by arguing with her version of authority, but by using the one she had stepped into without realizing it existed. Because she did not just put up a barrier on my bridge, she placed herself directly inside the one legal boundary she could not operate in, and that changed everything. By 4:10 p.m. the bridge had turned into something I had never seen before, not structurally, not physically, but socially. It had become a checkpoint, a place where people slowed down not because they needed to, but because they had been told to, and I stood off to the side long enough to watch the pattern form. Cars approaching, hesitation at the barrier, a brief exchange, then either a pass-through or a quiet turnaround. And what stood out was not the resistance but the lack of it, the way people accepted the inconvenience without questioning the authority behind it. And that told me Victoria's real strength was not the barrier itself but the perception she had built around it. And if I was going to dismantle what she had created, I needed more than documents. I needed witnesses, context, people who had already felt the edge of her system before it reached my bridge. So I started walking the line. Not physically across the span, but outward into the neighborhood that fed into it, gravel crunching under my boots as I moved past newly paved streets that still carried the faint smell of fresh asphalt and cut grass. Identical houses lined up with precise spacing. Every mailbox standing at the same height, like they had been measured with the same ruler, and I knocked on the first door that looked occupied. An older man answered, mid-60s, work shirt still on, hands rough in a way that told me he had lived a different kind of life before this place. And when I mentioned the bridge, his expression shifted instantly. Not surprise, not confusion, recognition, like he had been waiting for someone to say it out loud. And he stepped outside, lowering his voice even though there was nobody close enough to hear, and told me about the notices, the fines, the meetings that felt less like discussions and more like announcements. How rules kept changing just enough to stay ahead of anyone trying to push back. And he was not the only one. Door after door, the same pattern, different stories, but the same underlying structure. Pressure applied quietly, consistently, always framed as community improvement. And I listened more than I spoke, letting them fill in the gaps of a system I was only now seeing from the outside. Because every piece mattered, every small example of overreach built a larger picture of intent. And by the time I reached the corner lot near the entrance, the one with a clear view of the road leading to my bridge, I had enough to understand that this was not a one-time move. This was an expansion, and my bridge was just the latest target. And that is when I met Daniel Ruiz, a surveyor who had worked on the early phases of the development. And he did not even wait for me to ask before he started explaining what he had seen, pulling out copies of preliminary plats from his truck, paper edges curled from heat and use. showing me how the original plans had respected existing property lines, how the bridge had been clearly marked as private access, and how those markings had slowly been softened in later drafts, not erased, just adjusted enough to create ambiguity where there had been none before. And he tapped the page with his finger, right where the bridge connected to their internal road, and said this is where they started pushing, not legally, but visually, because if you redraw something enough times, people stop remembering what it used to look like. And that hit harder than any legal clause I had read earlier, because it explained how Victoria had built her position, not by changing ownership, but by changing perception. And as the sun started dropping lower, casting long shadows across the pavement, I stood there holding those documents, feeling the weight of something larger than just my situation, because this was not just about a bridge anymore. It was about a pattern of control that depended on people not pushing back. And for the first time since that barrier dropped in front of my truck, I was not standing alone on it. I had context. I had witnesses. I had people who had already seen what happened when you let her system run unchecked. And more importantly, I had something else forming in my mind. Not just evidence, but alignment, the kind that turns isolated problems into a unified response. And as I looked back toward the ridge where the steel span cut through the valley, I could almost see it differently now, not just as a structure I owned, but as the one point in her entire system that she could not fully control, no matter how many signs she printed or how many meetings she held, because control built on assumption only works until someone decides to test it. And I was done watching it work. By 7:03 p.m. the valley had gone quiet in that way it only does right before night fully settles in, the air cooling just enough to carry sound farther than it should, and I was back inside with every document spread across the table again. But this time nothing felt scattered. Everything had a place, a sequence, a purpose. And that is when the plan stopped being an idea and started becoming something structured, something deliberate. Because if Victoria had built her control on perception and momentum, then I was going to dismantle it using precision and timing, not by reacting to what she had done, but by forcing her into a position where every move she made would expose the gap between what she claimed and what actually existed. And the first step was documentation, not just what I had already collected, but real-time evidence. So I set up 2 cameras the next morning before sunrise, one at my end of the bridge angled toward the barrier, the other positioned along the tree line overlooking the approach road, both capturing every vehicle, every interaction, every moment that showed access being restricted without legal authority. And the soft click of those cameras activating felt like the start of something bigger, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet shift from observation to action. And by mid-morning I had hours of footage, cars turning around, drivers asking questions, the same rehearsed responses from the men at the barrier, all of it consistent, all of it undeniable. And while that was running, I made the second move, pulling in Daniel again along with a licensed land surveyor I had worked with years before, a woman named Claire Bennett who did not waste time on opinions, only measurements. And we walked the full length of the property lines, GPS equipment in hand, verifying every boundary point tied to the bridge, every coordinate aligning exactly with what was recorded decades ago. No overlap, no shared claim, nothing that could be interpreted as community property unless someone chose to ignore the data entirely. And Claire documented everything, timestamps, coordinates, visual markers, building a record that would hold up anywhere it needed to be presented. And that was when the structure of the plan locked into place, because now I had 3 layers working together: legal documentation, real-time evidence, and verified survey data, each one reinforcing the other, each one closing off the angles Victoria might try to use to justify what she had done. And the final piece came that afternoon when I drafted a formal notice that was very different from the one I had sent the day before. This one was not a request, it was a declaration outlining the exact legal boundaries, referencing the absence of any filed permit, documenting the unauthorized obstruction of a privately maintained structure, and most importantly defining the bridge as a controlled access point governed solely by the owner of both connecting parcels. Language pulled directly from the original engineering registration, not something she could argue around, not something she could reinterpret. And as I printed it out, the smell of ink filled the room, sharp and clean, and I read through it one more time, making sure every word did exactly what it needed to do, because this was not about convincing her. It was about positioning her, placing her inside a framework she could not operate in without exposing herself. And I drove down just before sunset, the sky turning that deep orange that stretches across the horizon. And I handed the notice directly to one of her men at the barrier. Watched him read just enough of it to realize it was not the same as before. Watched the hesitation settle in for a fraction of a second before he called her. And as I walked back to my truck, I could feel it, that shift again. But this time it was not uncertainty, it was alignment, everything moving in the same direction. Because the plan was no longer about removing a barrier. It was about controlling the situation she had created. And for the first time since this started, I was not reacting to her system, I was building one of my own. And it was designed to do one thing she had not accounted for: force reality back into a place where it could not be ignored. The next morning did not start with hesitation. It started with escalation, and I could hear it before I even reached the bridge. The low hum of multiple engines idling instead of the usual one or two, a cluster instead of a flow. And when I came around the bend, the scene had changed in a way that made everything sharper, more deliberate. Because Victoria had not backed down, she had doubled down. The temporary booth had been reinforced, a second barrier installed 10 feet behind the first. Cones placed in a neat line along the edge of the span like they were marking territory instead of guiding traffic. And there were more people now, not just the two from before but four, all wearing the same matching shirts, all holding clipboards like they were part of something official enough to go unquestioned. And the sign had been replaced with a larger one, bolted directly into the guardrail, the metal still bright where the drill had cut through, reading restricted access, authorized. Vehicles only in bold lettering that was designed to look like it came from somewhere with authority. And I stopped the truck halfway down the approach, watching as a family SUV pulled up ahead of me, a woman behind the wheel explaining something through her open window, pointing back toward the neighborhood, her voice carrying just enough for me to hear the frustration in it even if I could not catch every word. And one of Victoria's men shook his head, polite but firm, repeating the same script. And after a moment she turned the wheel, backing up slowly. Kids in the back seat watching everything through the glass like they were trying to understand why something so simple had suddenly become complicated. And that was when Victoria stepped into view again. Not rushed, not reactive, but composed. Like this was exactly how she wanted it to unfold. And she saw me before I moved, her expression tightening just slightly. Not concern, not fear, just recognition that I was no longer following the script she had expected. And she walked forward, stopping just short of the first barrier, heels clicking in that steady rhythm that seemed to mark time more than distance. And she held up a folder, thick, organized, deliberate. And even from where I stood, I could see the edges of printed pages inside. And she spoke before I could, her voice carrying across the span with that same measured confidence, explaining that her legal team had reviewed the situation overnight, that they had identified provisions allowing for community safety oversight in shared access scenarios, that the measures in place would remain until formal agreements were executed. And I listened, not because I believed any of it, but because I needed to hear exactly how she was framing her response. And it was clear she had pivoted, not backing off ownership but redefining the bridge as shared access without ever proving it, leaning on language that sounded official enough to create doubt without actually establishing authority. And she held up one of the pages slightly, like it was evidence, like it carried weight simply because it was printed. And that was her counter, not removal, not compliance, but reinforcement through perception, adding layers to the story she was telling until it became harder for anyone watching to separate what was real from what was presented. And behind her the men adjusted the cones, repositioned slightly, making the setup look even more intentional, more permanent. And I could feel the shift again, the way tension builds when two systems collide, hers based on control through assumption, mine built on structure and fact. And for a moment neither moved, just stood there on opposite sides of a barrier that should not have existed, the air thick with heat and expectation. And then she smiled, just a fraction, like she thought she had regained the upper hand, like adding more people and more signs and more paperwork had stabilized her position. And that was when I realized something important. She was not reacting to my evidence. She was trying to outpace it, to stay ahead long enough for her version to become accepted. And that meant she still did not understand where she was standing, because everything she had added, every extra barrier, every printed page, Every person she put on that span, it all depended on the same flaw, the same assumption that had been there from the beginning. And as I stepped out of the truck, closing the door with a solid, controlled sound that echoed across the steel, I knew exactly what she was trying to do, and more. Importantly, exactly why it was not going to work, because escalation only matters if the foundation holds, and she was building on something that had already started to crack. I did not walk toward the barrier right away. I let the moment stretch just long enough for everyone watching to settle into what they thought was about to happen. Another argument, another exchange, another attempt to push against something that looked official enough to hold. And the air felt different, tighter, like the valley itself was holding its breath. The late morning sun reflecting off the steel cables in sharp lines that cut across the scene, and I reached back into my truck, not for anything dramatic, just a folder, clean, organized, the same one I had assembled the night before, and as I stepped forward the sound of my boots on the bridge echoed in a way it had not before, not because it changed, but because now everyone was listening, and I stopped 10 feet from the first barrier, close enough to see the small details, the uneven drilling marks, the way the bolts had been set without proper spacing, temporary work trying to look permanent, and Victoria watched me without speaking, her posture still composed, but her eyes sharper now, tracking every movement, and I opened the folder slowly, deliberately, not for effect but for clarity, pulling out the first document and holding it where she could see it without needing to step closer, and I spoke in the same tone I had used from the beginning, calm, even, precise, explaining that the structure she was standing on was registered under private maintenance jurisdiction, that no permit had been filed for obstruction, that no easement existed granting her association access rights, and that every action taken here was now documented, time-stamped, and verified by licensed survey and recorded footage. And I could see the shift begin, not in her words yet, but in the people around her, the men with the clipboards who were no longer looking at drivers, but at me, at the papers, at her, trying to understand which version of authority they were supposed to follow. And she responded quickly, too quickly, repeating the same framework she had used before, community safety, shared access, legal review. But now there was something underneath it, something less certain, because she was no longer the only one presenting a system. And I let her finish again, because timing mattered more than volume. And when she paused, I set the second document on the hood of my truck, flattening it against the surface so the edges would not curl in the heat. The original survey overlay, clear lines, exact coordinates, both sides of the bridge tied to the same ownership. And I did not need to explain it in detail. The visual was enough, the kind that does not leave room for interpretation once you see it laid out correctly. And the man closest to her leaned slightly, just enough to read it. And that was the moment the balance shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, just a quiet realignment of understanding. And I took one more step forward, closing the distance to the barrier without crossing it, because that line mattered. Everything about this came down to where lines were drawn and who had the right to define them. And I told her something simple, something that did not sound like a threat because it was not one. It was a fact that by placing a controlled access system on a privately governed structure without authorization, she had assumed responsibility for that control. And that responsibility came with conditions she had not accounted for. And for the first time since this started, she did not respond immediately, her eyes flicking down to the documents, then back to me, recalculating, adjusting, trying to find a way to maintain the position she had built. And behind her, one of the men shifted his weight, looking at the barrier like it suddenly meant something different, like it was no longer just a piece of plastic and metal, but part of a system he might not fully understand. And the valley stayed quiet, engines idling, wind moving lightly across the span, and I could feel it settling into place, the exact moment where control stops being assumed and starts being questioned. And that is where systems either hold or they fail. And as I closed the folder, leaving the documents where they could be seen, I knew she was standing right at that edge, trying to hold on to something that had already started to slip. The silence held for a second longer than it should have, long enough for doubt to settle into places where confidence had been just minutes before, and I could see it ripple outward from Victoria, not in a dramatic collapse, but in small, precise shifts, the kind that only happen when a structure starts to lose its foundation. And she straightened slightly, adjusting her posture like she could reassert control through presence alone. And she stepped closer to the barrier, closing some of the distance between us without fully crossing it. Still careful, still calculated. And she tried again, her voice steady but carrying a sharper edge now, explaining that her legal team would be addressing the matter formally, that temporary measures would remain in place until a resolution was reached, and it sounded almost the same as before except for one detail. The certainty was gone, replaced by something that felt like delay, like she was buying time instead of defining terms, and behind her, the men with the clipboards were no longer focused on their roles. One of them had lowered his board entirely. Another was glancing between the documents on my truck and the barrier itself, as if trying to understand whether they were standing in the right place at all. And that was the moment I had been building toward, not confrontation, not escalation, but exposure, because once doubt enters a system built on assumption, everything connected to it starts to loosen, and I reached into my folder one more time and pulled out the final document, the engineering registration tied to operational control, and I placed it next to the survey, aligning the edges carefully, making sure the language was visible, not hidden behind explanation, but presented exactly as it was written, and I spoke again, not louder, not faster, just clearer, stating that by installing and maintaining a controlled access point on a privately governed structure, she had effectively declared operational control, and that declaration carried legal responsibility for access, safety, and authorization, responsibilities that could not be delegated, assumed, or shared without proper standing. And I let that sit, because it was not just information, it was positioning, placing her inside a framework she had not accounted for. And for the first time she did not respond at all, her eyes moving between the documents, the barrier, the people around her, recalculating again but with fewer options than before, and that was when the sound came from behind her, not loud, just a vehicle pulling up from the neighborhood side, a dark sedan easing to a stop at the second barrier, the driver waiting, watching, not saying anything yet, and one of her men turned instinctively, stepping toward the car like he had done all morning, but he hesitated halfway, glancing back at Victoria instead of moving forward, waiting for direction that did not come immediately, and that hesitation stretched, visible, undeniable. And I could see it land on her, the realization that control was no longer automatic, that every action now required confirmation, and that is where systems start to break down, not when they are challenged, but when they can no longer operate without constant reinforcement. And I stepped back then, just one step, creating space instead of closing it, because this was no longer about pushing. It was about letting the structure she had built reveal its own limits, and the driver in the sedan finally spoke, asking if he could pass, simple, direct, the same question everyone had asked all day, but now it carried weight, because the answer was no longer obvious, and Victoria opened her mouth slightly, then paused, just long enough for the moment to shift again, and in that pause everything she had put in place, the barriers, the signs, the people, the language, all of it hung in the balance, waiting for a response that would either hold it together or expose it completely. And I watched her carefully, not with urgency, not with pressure, just with the quiet certainty that comes from knowing exactly where the line is drawn and exactly who has the right to define it. Because she had spent days building a system that depended on everyone believing she was in control. And now she was standing in the middle of it, realizing that belief was no longer guaranteed. Victoria did not answer the driver right away, and that hesitation spread faster than anything she had built, because the moment authority pauses, people start to look around for where it actually comes from. And I watched as the man with the clipboard closest to the sedan lowered it completely, stepping back half a pace like he was no longer sure if he was supposed to be the one making decisions. And the engine idled louder in the silence, a low steady hum that filled the gap where her voice should have been. And then she finally spoke, but it came out different, slower, measured in a way that suggested she was choosing each word instead of delivering something already decided, telling the driver to wait while they clarified access status. And that single sentence shifted everything, because it replaced certainty with uncertainty, control with hesitation, and the driver did not move, did not argue, just sat there watching. And behind him another car pulled up, then another, the line forming again, but this time it was not orderly. It was questioning, heads turning, windows lowering, people trying to understand what had changed in the last few minutes, and I stepped back another pace, giving the space room to unfold. Because this was no longer about me pushing anything forward. It was about letting her system show its limits under its own weight. And one of her men approached her, speaking quietly but urgently, gesturing toward the documents on my truck, toward the cars, waiting, toward the barrier itself like it had suddenly become something more complicated than a piece of equipment. And she responded in the same low tone, but I could see the shift in her posture now, the tightness in her shoulders, the way her stance had moved from confident to defensive without her realizing it. And the sun had climbed higher, the heat rising off the steel invisible. Waves, the smell of warm metal mixing with exhaust and dust, and it felt like everything was being held in place by a thread that was starting to fray. And then the driver in the sedan asked again, simple, calm, "Can I pass?" And this time the question did not sound routine. It sounded like a test. And Victoria looked at the barrier, then at the documents, then at the people around her. And in that moment, she had to choose between maintaining a position she could not fully support or stepping back from something she had already pushed too far. And she exhaled slowly, just enough for me to see it, and gave a small nod to the man nearest the barrier. And that was all it took. He stepped forward, reached for the mechanism, and lifted the arm, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough for the sedan to roll through, tires humming softly across the span as it moved past. And that sound, that simple familiar sound of a vehicle crossing without interruption, carried more weight than anything said that morning, because it broke the pattern she had spent days establishing. And once it broke, it did not reset. The next car moved forward without waiting, then the next, the line dissolving into motion instead of hesitation, and her men stepped aside instinctively, no longer checking clipboards, no longer asking questions, just clearing space as the flow returned to what it had always been. And Victoria remained where she was, watching it happen, not stopping it, not directing it, just observing the system she had tried to build unravel in real time. And I did not say anything. I did not need to, because the outcome was already visible, not in a single action but in the shift of behavior around us, the way people moved without asking, the way the barrier now looked out of place instead of authoritative. And after a few minutes the bridge was no longer a checkpoint. It was just a bridge again. And that was the difference, not in structure but in control. And as the last car in the line passed through, the space between us felt different, quieter, not because the conflict was gone, but because its center had moved. And she looked at me once more, her expression no longer fixed, no longer certain, and for the first time since this started, she did not try to explain or justify anything. She simply stood there, facing the reality she had stepped into without understanding. And that was the moment it ended, not with an argument, not with a decision, but with the quiet recognition that the control she tried to take was never hers to begin with. The bridge sounded different that evening, not louder, not quieter, just right again. The steady roll of tires across steel returning to its natural rhythm, like something that had been held out of place, finally settling back where it belonged. And I stood at the edge of it, as the last light of the day stretched across the valley, long shadows cutting through the cables and down into the water below. And for the first time in days there was no hesitation in the movement, no slowing, no questions. Just flow, the way it had always been designed. And behind me the barrier still stood, but it looked smaller now, out of place, like a prop left behind after a performance nobody believed in anymore. And Victoria's people were already starting to pull things back, not in a rush, not in a scene, just quiet adjustments, cones being stacked, clipboards tucked under arms, the temporary structure losing its presence piece by piece. And she remained there a little longer than the rest, standing near the center of the span where she had tried to anchor her control, looking out across something she no longer directed. And there was no confrontation left to have, no words that would change what had already unfolded, because this was never about winning an argument. It was about restoring something that had been disrupted by assumption. And I walked past the spot where the barrier had been locked in, running my hand lightly along the guardrail where the metal still showed the marks from where they had drilled into it, shallow, imprecise, a reminder that control built quickly rarely accounts for what was already there. And I made a note to repair it properly, not because it was damaged beyond use, but because details matter, especially the ones that get overlooked when someone tries to take something that does not belong to them. And as I reached the midpoint of the bridge, I paused for a second, looking out over the land on both sides, the full span visible in a way that made the connection clear, not just physically but legally, structurally, intentionally, every part tied together in a way that could not be separated by a vote or a sign or a temporary setup. And that was the difference. Not just ownership, but understanding. The kind that comes from knowing exactly how something works at every level, from the bolts in the steel to the language in the documents. And that knowledge does not need to be loud. It does not need to be forced. It just needs to be applied at the right moment. And as I walked back toward my truck, the evening air carried the faint scent of cooling metal and river water, the same combination I had known since I was a kid, and it felt steady again, grounded, unchanged in the ways that actually mattered. And over the next few days, the rest of it faded out the way things like that always do when they are not supported by anything real. The signs disappeared, the booth was removed, the extra barriers taken down without announcement, and the neighborhood adjusted back to what it should have been, not because anyone explained it to them, but because the system that tried to replace it could not sustain itself once it was tested. And I saw Victoria once more from a distance a week later, her Lexus passing slowly along the road leading up to the bridge, not stopping, not directing, just moving through like everyone else, and that was enough. Because the point had already been made, not through force or volume, but through something much simpler, clarity. And as I stood there listening to the familiar sound of tires crossing steel, I thought about what my grandfather had said all those years ago, that if you control access, you control everything. And I understood it differently now, not as something you take, but as something you protect, because control is not about standing in the middle of something and claiming it. It is about knowing exactly where it begins and where it ends, and making sure nobody else forgets it. And the truth is, she never controlled that bridge. She just stood on it long enough to believe she did, until the moment she realized she was standing in the one place she never had authority over, and by then, it was already too late for her version of control to hold.